Welcome to the Finvox Finance Podcast. I'm Michael Bennett, your history enthusiast and finance nerd rolled into one.
And I'm Sarah Chen, ready to explore another fascinating historical figure whose decisions shaped not just a nation, but global finance and politics for centuries to come. Today, on the big LED screen behind us, we're showcasing the remarkable life of America's first president, George Washington.
You know, Sarah, it's amazing how many people know Washington as just the first president or the guy on the dollar bill. But there's so much more to his story.
Absolutely. And what a story it is. Let's start at the beginning. His childhood and early education. Born on February 22nd, 1732 in Pope's Creek, Virginia, George was the eldest child of Augustine and Mary Ball Washington.
And immediately we encounter something surprising about his education. Unlike many founding fathers who attended prestigious universities, Washington had very limited formal schooling.
That's right. When his father died, George was just 11 years old. The family couldn't afford to send him to college, and he ended up being largely self-educated.
Can you imagine trying to lead a revolution and then a country with just an elementary school education? That's like me trying to explain derivatives after watching a 5-minute YouTube tutorial.
Well, he made up for it with practical experience. Look at this image on our screen. Young Washington working as a surveyor in the Virginia wilderness. That job gave him incredible knowledge of the American landscape that would serve him well during the Revolutionary War.
Speaking of which, let's talk about that military career. It didn't exactly start off smoothly. In 1754, during the French and Indian War, he led an attack that essentially sparked an international conflict.
Talk about a workplace mistake. Most of us worry about sending an awkward email to the wrong person. Washington accidentally started a global war between empires.
But what's fascinating is how he learned from each experience. By the time the Continental Congress appointed him commander-in-chief in 1775, he had developed a unique approach to military leadership. He wasn't necessarily a tactical genius.
No, his real genius was strategic. He understood something profound. He didn't need to win every battle. He just needed to keep his army intact and avoid catastrophic defeat. Fighting a war of attrition against a global superpower took incredible patience and foresight.
Right. And we've got this dramatic painting on screen now. Washington crossing the Delaware on Christmas night, 1776. This was after a string of defeats had nearly destroyed the Revolution. Talk about a high-pressure comeback moment.
The password for that mission was victory or death. Washington was literally gambling everything on this surprise attack against Hessian mercenaries at Trenton.
You know what makes this even more remarkable? Washington was wealthy. He could have just sat out the war at Mount Vernon, protected his assets, and made peace with the British. Instead, he risked everything.
That brings us to an interesting point, his financial status. Washington was actually one of the wealthiest Americans of his time. When he died in 1799, his estate was valued at around $780,000, which would be nearly $600 million today.
$600 million? I thought public service wasn't supposed to pay that well.
It didn't. Washington built his wealth through land ownership, inheritance, and yes, marriage. When he married Martha Custis in 1759, she was already one of the wealthiest widows in Virginia, bringing significant assets to their union.
It's interesting to note that despite his wealth, Washington often struggled with cash flow problems. He was what financial advisors today would call asset rich but cash poor, land wealthy but sometimes struggling with liquidity.
I think that's part of what made him so effective as America's first president. He understood both wealth and financial hardship. Look at this image of Mount Vernon. His plantation was magnificent, but he meticulously tracked every expense and understood the value of financial discipline.
We should acknowledge something important here. A significant portion of Washington's wealth came from enslaved labor. By the time of his death, more than 300 enslaved people lived and worked at Mount Vernon.
That's true, and it's a complex part of his legacy. Washington's views on slavery evolved over his lifetime. By the end of his life, he had made provisions in his will to free his enslaved people upon Martha's death, the only founding father to do so.
Let's talk about his political journey. After leading the Continental Army to victory, Washington did something truly extraordinary. He gave up power. King George III reportedly said if he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world.
And he did it twice. First, when he resigned his military commission in 1783, and then when he stepped down as president after 2 terms, establishing the peaceful transfer of power that's central to democracy.
I've always wondered what Washington was like as a person. What kind of leadership style did he have?
By all accounts, he was dignified, reserved, and possessed immense self-control. Here's an interesting fact. He rarely raised his voice, but when he did, it made a tremendous impact. During the Battle of Monmouth in 1778, he was so angry at General Charles Lee's retreat that soldiers were shocked by his fury.
I can relate. I'm usually calm too, but when my fantasy football team loses, watch out.
I somehow doubt Washington would have been a fantasy football enthusiast. But speaking of personal traits, despite his stern public image, his step-grandchildren described him as affectionate and even playful in private.
That reminds me, Washington and Martha never had children of their own, right?
Correct. Martha had 4 children from her first marriage, but only 2 survived to adulthood, John Parke Custis and Martha Parke Custis. While Washington never formally adopted them, he raised them as his own. And after John died during the Revolutionary War, the Washingtons raised his 2 youngest children, Eleanor and George Washington Parke Custis.
So the father of his country was actually a devoted stepfather and step-grandfather too. That seems fitting somehow.
Let's share some interesting facts about Washington that many people might not know. For instance, contrary to popular belief, his teeth weren't made of wood.
They weren't? What were they made of?
His dentures were actually made from various materials, including ivory, gold, lead, and human teeth, likely purchased from enslaved people or poor individuals who sold them for money. Not exactly the most heartwarming fun fact.
Ouch. That's definitely not in the elementary school textbooks.
Here's another surprising one. Washington was actually an innovative farmer. He experimented with crop rotation, fertilizers, and new tools. He even won an award for breeding mules.
America's first president, war hero, founding father, and award-winning mule breeder. That's quite a resume.
He was also incredibly conscious of setting precedents for future presidents. Everything from establishing a cabinet system to limiting himself to 2 terms, which wasn't required until the 22nd Amendment in 1951, shaped how we understand the presidency today.
I think that's perhaps his greatest legacy. Not just what he did, but what he refused to do. He could have been a king or president for life, but he chose to step away from power.
So what can we learn from Washington today?
I think his example teaches us about the importance of character, self-restraint, and putting collective interests above personal gain.
Absolutely. In an era when narcissism is celebrated and everyone wants to be a celebrity, Washington's humility and service are powerful counterexamples. He once wrote, "I hope I shall possess firmness and virtue enough to maintain what I consider the most enviable of all titles, the character of an honest man."
In finance and leadership, those qualities are still invaluable. Integrity, strategic thinking, persistence through hardship, and knowing when to walk away from power. These are timeless principles.
You know, we often think of great historical figures as perfect, but Washington's life shows us that greatness includes acknowledging imperfections and striving to overcome them. He owned enslaved people, yet worked toward their eventual freedom. He made military mistakes, yet learned from them. He was human, complicated, and constantly evolving.
That's what makes historical figures worth studying. Not because they were perfect, but because they were human beings grappling with the same fundamental questions we face today about power, responsibility, freedom, and justice.
Well put, Sarah. And I think that wraps up our journey through the remarkable life of George Washington, military leader, president, businessman, and complex human being.
That was today's story from Finvox Finance Podcast, where history meets reality.